I think there's a perception that the American military has never been defeated, which of course is misleading, if not outright wrong. Yet we found it impossible to win the war. So I think that has to be re-examined. There are various ways you win and lose, and this goes back to the attrition model we were discussing before. You can expend all your resources and be defeated not by the enemy, but by your own stupidity. That, I think, is what's happening to some extent in Ukraine, although admittedly, the Russians are doing far more what's right than what's wrong. I think we're not even in the game. We're not even considering these things. We're not looking at any of our potential vulnerabilities. We only see what we believe to be strengths, but those strengths, in many cases, haven't recently been tested. And if you fight someone like Russia, those things will be tested. If I see anything, I see a stronger Russia, a more cohesive societal structure in Russia, greater faith and confidence in the Russian state and in Russian nationalism. And I don't see that happening in Europe. In fact, this is the problem with this NATO alliance. There are diverging interests. People in Berlin are looking at what's going on in Poland and have concluded the Poles have lost their minds. They're not interested in being part of a war in Russia. I don't know of anybody in Italy or Greece or France or Spain that's interested in being dragged into a war with Russia. Yes. British ruling classes had this vision of England, primarily, that didn't exist anymore, that had vanished as a result of the First World War. And we have a similar situation right now. If you ask the ruling elites here about America, they wax eloquently about America. Well, have you visited it lately? I talked to someone the other day who insisted that, this inflation isn't all that bad and we can master this and get by. And I said, drive 100 miles west, 100 miles north, or 100 miles south of Washington, D.C., and go to the food banks and look at the lines of people in the food banks waiting to be fed. I said, things are not good, but this same sort of disconnect is there. But we, unlike Great Britain, don't have the United States that's going to march in and supplant what we don't have with their capabilities. Our European contemporaries, our colleagues in all of those governments have gleefully participated in the systematic deindustrialization of their societies and the destruction of national identity, with the exception of Hungary. And I would say also with the exception, interestingly enough, of the Poles. The thing, though, is that, and dare I mention his name, who is normally viewed as the Antichrist inside the Beltway, and that's Donald Trump, who made the argument that the Europeans had to become their own first responders. It's a very simple statement. But being your own first responder automatically translates into some degree of sovereignty, independence, judgment, thought, strategy, all of which have been swept away through 50, 60 years of NATO. But there's also another part of this vision that's very important, and that is that we see the world as this multipolar place, and that's not an unhealthy thing. And increasingly, we see regions emerging, regional structures, regional organizations, which is something Hedley Bull predicted many years ago in the 70s and the 60s. You can view that as positive, or you can see it as negative. Now, if you're an imperialist, you live in Versailles on the Potomac, oh, that's terrible, because that means you no longer have control. And ultimately, it's our control which is the issue in this war with Russia. Well, there's no doubt that this war on an ideological level is inextricably intertwined with all of the other misconstrued ideas and confused mindsets. I don't know that there's an easy solution, but something's going to happen in the near future. This is going to collapse. This narrative is going to fail. It's just like all these supposed Russian atrocities. And many of us have looked at these accusations and allegations and found wanting. They just don't hold up. On the other hand, the Ukrainian forces have done some very terrible things. And so this is all going to collapse. And the question is, when it collapses, will we be able to step back? Now, there's one thing working in our favor, and that is that more and more Americans are saying, you want to march into Ukraine with 40,000 troops and 30,000 Polish troops and 20,000 Romanian troops? What's wrong with our borders? Why don't we protect our borders? What are we doing for our own national security? This is a legitimate question, and it's beginning to come up more and more. People are not happy with the situation. Well, my classmate, Ray Odierno, who passed away not long ago, when he was chief of staff, she said, I hear people telling us to do more with less. He said, why can't we do less with less? That's a legitimate question. And that was about as far as he was willing to go. I wish he'd gone further, but it's true. And it's back to covenants without swords. We have a shrinking military establishment. We have a military establishment right now, which for a whole range of reasons, a lot of people don't want to serve in. And then we have 30 years of senior officer selection that have led to a group of senior leaders that, frankly, most of us on any normal day would not follow, even out of idle curiosity. They don't have any gut-wrenching experiences in their background. They don't exhibit professional depth. My point is that we seem to have preferred people that were anxious to go along. Oh, yes, of course. If that's what you want, that's your new policy. We'll support it. Whatever it is, just promote me.
I don't believe that Russia could have occupied a Kiev that was committed to defending itself with the 40, 60, 80,000 troops that it had committed to that northern thrust. I believe that Russia did attempt what I would call a coup de main early on. You saw Russian airborne forces come into Hostomel airfield and other airfields they attempted to take over. And I believe that the goal was to seize these airfields and then fly in some airborne troops who would be capable of launching a very targeted operation against Ukrainian leadership targets, things of that nature. We don't know because it never played out. Ukrainians resisted at Hostomel. The other airfields weren't fully seized, and the Russians withdrew. And the Ukrainian resistance stiffened from the very beginning. So there's a lot of speculation. Russia hasn't come out and explained what it was doing. I think any military analyst worth their salt will buy into the notion that this wasn't simply just seizing an airfield, that this was part of an overall campaign that sought to have the rapid collapse of the Ukrainian government so that you wouldn't have to fight for Kiev, occupy Kiev. You could simply walk in and seize the presidential palace, seize the parliament, and seize the Ministry of Defense and bring in a new government. That didn't work. Then you're left with, why did the Russians continue? Because every plan has to have a fallback. I mean, any military person that plans an operation that is contingent upon 100% of everything in the plan going right or else, you're going to get the or else quicker rather than later. And so when the coup de main failed, what you're left with is a Russian thrust on Kiev designed to make the Ukrainian government believe that Russia is serious about taking Kiev. But you can't be serious about taking a city of 4 or 5 million, massive city with a force of 40, 60, 80,000. What you can do is threaten the city and compel the Ukrainians to commit forces and resources to the defense of the city that otherwise would be sent elsewhere, for instance, to the east of Ukraine. So I think that the Russian attack on Kiev became a feint designed to achieve a certain outcome. It's also apparently a chip to be negotiated. The Russians and the Ukrainians were holding peace talks or ceasefire talks in Belarus early on that then gravitated to Istanbul on April 1st. On March 25th, the Russians announced the end of phase one of the operation, and they said, which means that they were no longer going to be threatening Kiev. They were going to withdraw and reallocate their forces to the primary task of liberating the Donbass. And as a good faith effort, they withdrew the troops. This is the Russian version, as a concession to get Ukraine to come to the negotiating table to negotiate an end to the conflict, which would give Russia the Donbass, Crimea, exactly what William Burns wrote about, by the way, in his memorandum in 2008. And Ukraine appeared to be ready to take this deal. And then, of course, NATO intervened. Boris Johnson flew to Kiev, told Zelensky on no circumstances could Ukraine carry this out, or they'd lose all the Western support. And so the Ukrainians threw away that peace deal. But, Russia was apparently not serious about taking Kiev because you don't give up the advantageous position that they had. They were positioned around Kiev. If you had pressed the attack, you could have surrounded Kiev. You could have starved the city out. You could have done any number of things, but that's not what the Russians did. They continued to feint for about a month to freeze the Ukrainians in position, and then they voluntarily withdrew. Now, this was perceived as a weakness on the part of the West, who then convinced the Ukrainians that this was a weakness and led them to believe that if they absorbed tens of billions of dollars worth of munitions and training, et cetera, that they could actually defeat the Russians. And this led to phase two of the conflict. But Kiev, I don't believe, was ever intended to be physically occupied by Russia. Let's be clear about one thing. The Ukrainian government knows exactly what happened in Bucha. They know exactly what happened in Bucha. And the reason why they know exactly is because they perpetrated the crimes in Bucha. We know this. We know it because a Ukrainian politician got on the air, did a live broadcast, a female politician, where she told people, stay indoors. Don't be alarmed by the shooting. It's simply the Ukrainian forces carrying out a cleansing operation. This was at the time when the massacre was initiated. We know that the next day, the Ukrainian security services, the SBU, put on their website an announcement that the Safari unit of their special forces were going to be cleansing Bucha of all saboteurs and collaborationists. We know that was taking place. Now, anybody at this point in the game, maybe back then, people could say, well, cleansing, that's like a law enforcement operation. They're just going to go in and they're going to arrest these people. And then they're going to, of course, turn them over to prosecutors where they'll be afforded all of the protections under the rule of law, in a defense in a court, right? That's what cleansing means. No, we know today exactly what cleansing means. Cleansing is the slaughtering of civilians who were deemed to be sympathetic to the Russians. And the bodies that were found on the street were wearing the white armbands that showed that they were telling the Russians, we're not a threat, or they're saying we're on the side of Russia. They were carrying Russian humanitarian aid packages, which we now know receipt of which makes you a collaborationist. So you're starving to death in Bucha. The Russians hand you a humanitarian package, and that becomes a death sentence, because that's exactly what happened, because we now have a video of this unit where a very notorious, Ukrainian neo-Nazi ultranationalist who operated under the fighting name of the boatsman is giving a green light for his soldiers to shoot people who aren't wearing the blue, green, or yellow identifying armband. If you're not wearing it, you're wearing white, you die, you get shot. We know this happened. We know this happened. It's not a debate. We know this happened. And yet, what the Ukrainians have done is flip the script and said, no. The bodies that were there were killed by the Russians, part of their overall policy of brutalizing the Ukrainian people. No. Anybody who wants to make the case that Russia did this, give me the forensic investigation, please. Ukraine had control of the crime scene. Bodies are right there. So if you're going to say Russia did it, show me the autopsy on the body. First question, when did they die? Every single body should be cataloged. When did they die? Why is this important? Because people put up a satellite image taken by, an American commercial satellite business that has very nefarious links to American intelligence. These satellite images have been released repeatedly to try and shape perception about something or else. They released things that said, no, these bodies have been there since, I think, March 9th, around that time frame. Okay, there's not a coroner worth his or her salt that couldn't sit there and give me, within hours what the time of death of the body was. Every coroner is capable of doing this. Everyone, even a Ukrainian coroner, is able to say this is the time of death. So if the bodies were truly killed on March 9th, as the satellite image and the Ukrainians are saying, you'd be able to certify that with science. With science. No time of death. Mechanism of death. How did they die? Were they shot by a bullet? Was the bullet fired in them once they were already dead, or did the bullet actually inflict the damage that killed them? Were they hit by mortar fragments, artillery fragments? What killed them? Were they shot in the front, shot in the back? Show me how the body failed and reconstruct when the body, before it hit the ground, where it's standing. Then show me the line of the point of entry. Did the bullet come from a Russian position, or did the bullet come from a Ukrainian position? Ukrainian force advancing, killing people. This is so easy to do. The other thing is, what kind of bullet killed them? Are they the bullets that are part of the weaponry carried by Russian forces, the AK-12 or whatever they're calling their new assault weapon, or were they bullets fired by the Ukrainians who use a different kind of thing? These are all questions that are answerable, knowable. And if you're going to make the case against Russia, that's the first thing you do. You say, this is the body. This is the name of the individual. They died at this date, this time. This is the mechanism of death. It all points to the Russians doing it. That's how you make a case. That's not how the Ukrainians made the case. They just simply said, Russia did it. And they ignored the fact that they have virtual confessions from various Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian security services, and video evidence of the crime being perpetrated. They ignore that. So I'm going to tell you right now, that every German listening there, because I know what I'm about to say is a crime in Germany. If I were German saying this, I would be arrested and go to jail. There was a war crime committed in Bucha. The crime was committed by the Ukrainians. They did it. Your government supports them. That makes you complicit in the war crime.